minutes or so to, or maybe a little longer. Good afternoon. This is an open letter that is dated the 4th of April, 2013, and it is addressed to the Clifton Heritage Authority, which is on Western Bay Road at Clifton Point on this island of New Providence in the Bahamas, and it is made attention to all of the board members of the Clifton Heritage Authority. It reads, "Dear sirs and madams," the reference is resignation of entire board of the Clifton Heritage Authority. I write as a beneficiary of the Clifton Heritage, which was declared by the Parliament of the Bahamas to be an inalienable part of the national patrimony of the Bahamas, a fact evidenced in Section 3.2 of the Clifton Heritage Authority Act 2004, which was assented to on the 24th of June 2004 and commenced on the 25th of April 2005. The Clifton Heritage, and by that, the Clifton Heritage was vested in the Clifton Heritage Authority, and thereupon it was settled upon a statutory trust for the use and benefit of the people of the Bahamas. In addition to being a beneficiary under the Act, I had the distinct privilege of serving as a Member of Parliament when the bill for the Act was laid, debated, and passed. On the 29th of January 2004, I contributed to the debate with a 2-hour historical account of the struggle, as well as to defining Parliament's ultimate intention behind the Act. As a beneficiary, therefore, and a direct participant in the creation of the Act and ultimately the Clifton Heritage Authority, I hereby call upon all of you to forthwith resign your respective posts on the Clifton Heritage Authority in accordance with Section 7 of the second schedule of the Act. Failure to do this will result in steps being taken to have your appointment revoked pursuant to Section 8 of the schedule of the Act. This might include the commencement of an action before the Supreme Court of the Bahamas for judicial review of the decision taken by the board of the Clifton Heritage Authority to openly align itself and thereby compromise the integrity of the authority by supporting or being reckless as to whether it gives the impression that it supports the private cause of a Louis Bacon, descendant from North Carolina, USA, but now of the state of New York in the United States of America, and whose alter ego is the local so-called non-profit organization carrying the name of the Coalition to Protect Clifton Bay. And I will refer to that entity as Bacon's Coalition for the rest of this reading. This alliance has been widely publicized and touted by Bacon's Coalition with no demand of a retraction from the Clifton Heritage Authority Board or any of its members. I believe that this failure amounts to a breach of your individual and collective duties, ostensibly as trustees of the authority. This is especially the case when unashamedly you openly display your lack of loyalty and commitment and respect to the beneficiaries of the Clifton Heritage Authority by publishing the image of Dr. Keith Wisdom, chairman of the authority, and that of a member, Mr. Bennett Atkinson, in public ads by the Bacon's Coalition as being members of the board of Bacon's Coalition. Their involvement was in their respective capacities as board members of the authority. I am therefore of the view that the level of objectivity and proper judgment necessarily required of persons serving on the authority is not met by any of the members currently serving on the authority itself, as it is currently constituted. These characteristics are absolute requirements which must be inculcated in the demeanor of, if not simply demonstrative, by the public stance taken by those who are asked to serve on the board of the Clifton Heritage Authority. They are the guardians of this sacred place where rest the souls of our Lucayan, African, and Loyalist ancestors, the preservation of which stands as the testament of the rarest of occasions when a grassroots movement in the Bahamas achieved unity over a short 6-year campaign beginning in 1998 and ending in 2004 with the promulgation of the Act. That grassroots movement, led by a harmonious quartet of Bahamians, Ms. Sam Duncombe, Reverend Dr. C.B. Morse, Mr. Vivian Wiley, and me, was endorsed on the 30th of March 2000 by the current Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, the Right Honorable Perry Christie, who was then leader of Her Majesty's official opposition, when he spoke from the shores of Clifton and committed himself and his Progressive Liberal Party to stopping the development of a luxurious gated community that the then governing party of the Free National Movement, led by the Right Honorable Mr. Hubert Ingram, had intended to approve at that time. Some of us believed that the public dialogue was the government's simply going through the motion to give effect to a fait accompli. In spite of this achievement of unity, Bacon's coalition has been formed for the purpose of being divisive, regressive, and an endorsement of Base's overt racist cause aimed at Bahamians and our way of life. According to a press statement of Bacon's coalition dated the 21st of March 2013, Bacon bases the coming into existence of his coalition on the unsupported scientific premise pronounced by one of its members, Associate Professor at the Department of Biology of the University of Miami, Ms. Kathleen Sullivan-Seeley. She says that the Clifton Bay is under massive threat because its conch population risks dying out because of the lack of proper oversight of the government and little, if or non-existence, of regulation of fishing, tourism, transport, coastal development, and other human activities occurring in Clifton Bay. She makes an absolute astounding conclusion, which attacks Prime Minister Perry Christie and his current PLP government, and questions the ethics of those who have or are likely to have the decision in respect of which she and Bacon's coalition complains, and that is that the conservation and protection of the Clifton Bay is being sacrificed by the government of the Bahamas for short-term interests. As you ought to know, the Minister of the Bahamas government with portfolio responsibility for the seabed of the Bahamas, inclusive of Clifton Bay, is Prime Minister Perry Christie. He is also the Minister with portfolio responsibility to have relations with the Clifton Heritage Authority, on whose consultation the Governor General would have made the appointment of each and every member currently on the Clifton Heritage Authority. Mr. Christie is also the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party, which since the late 1950s became the primary political organization that championed the cause of the black majority of the Bahamas toward political and economic equality. I was appalled. I was absolutely appalled and grossly offended by the full-color double-trunk advertisement that appeared in all of the dailies last week that was sponsored by the Bacon's Coalition, when it stated that Bacon's Coalition was, and I quote, which was to shortly be announcing a series of financial grants of existing Bahamian organizations with whom they will be partnering and the uses of such grants. I believe that Bacon's Coalition is fully funded by Mr. Bacon himself. Not only is the Clifton Heritage Authority listed as a member of Bacon's Coalition, it is listed as one such entity that is partnering with Bacon's Coalition. A close inspection of the advertisement and website of Bacon's Coalition reveals that Bacon's real target in the premises is the premises of his neighbor, Peter Nygaard. That hidden agenda is found under the heading Reversing Harmful Development Impacts on Sims Point/Nygaard Key, close quote. With this in mind, the Clifton Heritage Authority's receipt of or any of its members or any agreement to receive money from Bacon and his coalition on the condition that he specified in the advertisements compromises any position now taken by the Clifton Heritage Authority in relation to the Clifton Bay area or Clifton itself. At best, such positions are subject to a high degree of suspicion that necessarily requires the greatest amount of scrutiny. Could it be that the Clifton Heritage Authority is signing off on Bacon's agenda to return from the grants, in return from the grants of monies to it or any of his members? Matters are made worse by the fact that his hidden agenda neglects to mention otherwise hides the fact that in 2005 to 2006, Bacon unlawfully constructed a boat basin on the Life of Key property known as the Point House, where he is said to live when he's in the Bahamas. That boat basin was suspiciously constructed underneath the house so that one could not be seen boarding, loading, or offloading the vessels that dock there. You are to note that when the boat basin was being built, I was serving as the Bahamas Ambassador for the Environment and Chairman of the Bahamas Environment, Science and Technology Commission. In those capacities, and according to the policy of the government at that time, such activity would have required my direct involvement and approval prior to any permits being issued under the Conservation and Protection of the Physical Landscape of the Bahamas Act of 1997 for the construction of that boat basin. Not only can I definitively state that I did not issue any such approval, in December of 2010, documents were tabled in the Bahamas Senate by the current Attorney General, Senator the Honorable Mrs. Allison Gibson, that confirmed that no approval was given by any government agency at that time for Bacon's construction of the boat basin and the secretive underhouse dock. Now, accordingly, your attack on Peter Nygaard and the Prime Minister in relation to the standard area of the south of Nygaard's premises falls foul, in my opinion, of the rules against public discourse on issues that are sub judice. The primary issue of the ongoing proceedings before the Supreme Court of the Bahamas in action number 1447 of 2011 is whether, as a matter of law, the said standard area accumulated there was by way of accretion, as opposed to what amounts to reclamation of land from the seabed. This Supreme Court action, which remains extant before the Supreme Court of the Bahamas, is known by Bacon, or ought reasonably to have been known by him and his chief spokesperson of the Bacon's coalition, Mr. Fred Smith. I believe the actions of the Bacon's coalition to be contemptuous and unlawful, in that it is clearly attempting to excite popular prejudice against Mr. Peter Nygaard in the proceedings of Supreme Court Action number 1447 of 2011. The reality is that Bacon's coalition was only formed by Bacon after he had been turned back and rebuked for his outrageous lie at the Audubon Society in New York in February of 2013 on the occasion of him being awarded with a prestigious award for environmental leadership. He lied when he said that he was the leader of the said grassroots movement 14 years ago, which led the saving of the Clifton heritage. I see the formation of Bacon's coalition as his desperate attempt to co-opt the Clifton Heritage Authority to serve his hidden racist agenda, along with leading environmental organizations and persons by flaunting his huge cash grants to the Clifton Heritage Authority and those persons and other organizations. It is no mistake that he has used a name that is very close to the original body, that is, say, the Coalition to Save Clifton, that championed the cause 14 years ago, which has now risen again in the form of Saving Clifton again, to push back on his attempt to revise and rewrite our history. In fact, this offer of money to the Clifton Heritage Authority, and maybe even its members, as set out in the petition of Bacon's coalition, amounts, in my view, to bribery and contrary to the provisions of the Prevention of Bribery Act 1978. And you can see the details of his petition on the website that is indicated in the letter. Now, although Bacon would have you believe that the purpose of Bacon's coalition is to save the conch in Clifton Bay, what he has posted on the website clearly shows that they wish to bar all Bahamians from using any of the coastline of Clifton to fish off of rocks or by boat, or otherwise to use Clifton Bay for recreation. From what I can see, particularly with the installation of fencing and gates that are kept continually locked to cordon off certain parts of the Clifton Heritage Authority, to keep our people out of utilizing the facilities, I have every reason to believe that the Clifton Heritage Authority has agreed with Bacon on some, if not all, of what his coalition has set out in their various publications. Further, the callous bulldozing of wetlands at the northern side of the Clifton Heritage Authority evidences ignorance in environmental terms or simply disregard for the environment, both of which feeds the rumor that certain parts of Clifton is being offered to Bacon for purchase so that he can give effect to keeping Bahamians off of the Clifton heritage. This state of affairs cannot be allowed to stand. The fact that Bacon claims to be the owner of a 50 million sprawling palatial fortress called the Point House, aka the Rocks, on the northern side of Clifton Bay in Liefeld Key, taking up more than 1,000 feet of the northern side of Clifton Bay, should not have missed your collective knowledge. During his acceptance speech at the Audubon Society, Bacon said the most reprehensible thing one can say in Christendom when he said that, and I quote, "In times of questioning of self-doubt, I reach for the Holy Book for answers." Now, as a Southerner, you have to realize that when I say the Holy Book, of course I mean Gone with the Wind, end quote. He went on to draw attention to a passage that is found in chapter 2 of that book, when the father of the main character, Scarlett, was admonished by her father for her disregard of her plantation home. Bacon read that passage aloud. It states, and I quote, "Land is the only thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for, because it's the only thing that lasts." Amazingly, that is the end quote. Amazingly, Bacon concluded that portion of his speech by figuratively draping himself in this racist past by saying that extract, and I quote, "kind of sums up his philosophy," or my philosophy was his words. I have now traced Bacon's maternal heritage to his great-grandfather, the late Lieutenant Colonel Roger Moore, the last commander of the 3rd North Carolina Cavalry of the 41st Regiment of the Confederate States Army. Lieutenant Colonel Moore is infamously heralded as being the chief of the division of the Ku Klux Klan in Wilmington, North Carolina, where he then resided. In fact, it is recorded in the electronic version of the New York Public Library that after taking the secret oath at Raleigh in North Carolina in 1868, Lieutenant Colonel Moore organized and commanded the Ku Klux Klan at Wilmington, which was a black majority city. Now, believed to be the commander of the general organization of the Secret Committee of 9, a white supremacist group led by Alfred Moore Waddell, Bacon's great-grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Moore, was intricately involved in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, when more than 100 black people were killed simply because a Wilmington-based organization called the Committee of Colored Citizens refused to commit and to shut down a black-owned newspaper. With the recent purchase of the Orton plantation in North Carolina, which used to be owned by the family of Mr. Bacon in early 1700s, we believe that Bacon is attempting to resurrect his racist heritage in hopes to continue the same wherever he goes, including the Bahamas. Now, with this in mind, I would say that the chickens of Bacon's heritage, through his actions of trying to rewrite the history of Clifton and extinguish its heritage by writing black people right out of it, are simply coming home to roost. With a heritage such as his, I can see why Bacon would demonstrate so comfortably through his utterances at the Audubon Society, why he would, in 2013, openly show his disdain and dislike of black people or anything that seeks to revere us. A man's past is as much a part of whom and what he is, unless he publicly condemns the acts of his forebears. Bacon has not simply neglected to condemn his great-grandfather for what he represented or stood to support. He has overtly praised those unacceptable attitudes in his acceptance speech at the Audubon Society Award ceremony. I conclude that Bacon is not only a reprehensible revisionist who has found out who's been found out. He is an unashamed and bold racist with his eyes on owning and controlling our Clifton heritage. After all, it is widely known in the literary world that Gone with the Wind is considered a book which glorifies the right of the American South to keep their plantation system and their slaves. An excerpt from a critique by In Ivory Live Journal, which is found on the World Wide Web, supports this conclusion, and I will quote this. It's quoted, "Gone with the Wind is a racist, revisionist Southern apologetic. Not just racist in a, well, it was written in 1936, so what do you expect kind of way, but offensively, horribly racist, even by the standards of the time in which it was written. Margaret Mitchell, that is the author, was a wealthy debutante in the post-South, raised with the bitter taste of defeat still in the mouths of her Confederate grandparents. And her novel was, as novelist Pat Conry, who wrote the preface of the 75th anniversary edition, says, a clenched fist raised to the North, an anthem of defiance. And there's a quote that is very hard for me to say because they're writing it in, I guess, slave terminology. It says, God Almighty, Miss Scarlett, are scared to go running around in the dark by myself. Suppose the Yankees get me. Of course, a writer can write from the viewpoint of Southern slave owners who, of course, would be racist and view black people with, at best, benevolent paternalism without her character's attitude necessarily being her own. But it's very apparent that Mitchell was wholly and uncritically sympathetic to her antebellum ancestors. The Old South was a graceful, chivalrous land where slavery was not a horrible and oppressive institution, creating generations of misery and oppression, but a divinely ordained means of preserving racial harmony. And for all that Mitchell, like her characters, probably considered herself to be kind and affectionate to all African Americans she knew personally. There isn't a single black character in the book who isn't an ignorant, semi-human ape, which is literally how they are described. Even beloved Mammy is repeatedly compared to a monkey. From Margaret Mitchell's version of history, one would get the impression that the only negative thing about slavery was that some slaves were unlucky enough to have mean owners, who were almost always of Yankee descent, since the only really evil people in the book and the only white people who actually mistreated blacks are Yankees. And that is the end quote from that critique. Now, interestingly, during the 1998-2004 Save Clifton campaign, I was approached by persons saying that they represented the More Charitable Foundation, who attempted to get my support and approval as one of the key leaders in that campaign to have a portion of the cost of the Clifton heritage in exchange for contributing the $25 million+ that was needed to pay the original owners of the land who was entitled to be paid as a result of the acquisition of it in 1989 by the Bahamas government, then led by the father of our nation, Sir Lyndon Pinley. Of course, their overtures was flatly refused by me. I have only learned in recent years that the More Charitable Foundation is Bacon's foundation, which carries the maiden name of his mother and that of his great-grandfather we just spoke of. Bacon will soon learn that the words of my holy book always comes to pass, for the words therein is truly the only thing in this world that will last. In fact, he will soon learn the power of Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 to 7, which states, "Then the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children, unto the third and fourth generation." In this regard, I can announce that I have commenced discussion with local bodies, those in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, to explore and implement legal action and lobby effort to parliaments and Congress of those countries and all others where he does business and own homes, either in his personal or business capacities, either as more capital fund or more charitable foundation, for reparations against any family business associated with the wealth he boasts, either from the days of the African slave trade to the days of Jim Crow in the United States, to the recent meltdown of the mortgage markets in the United States, in which it is reported that black people there had an unusual share of the losses experienced. It is for these reasons, although not exhaustive, that we require, and I require, this existing board, the statutory trustees, to resign. It's the only honorable thing for you to do in the kind of system of governance which we laud, this Westminster. Should the board not immediately resign, steps will be taken to compel you to so resign, and I sign off on this as a beneficiary of the Clifton Heritage Authority, as Keod Smith. The letter is copied to the relevant authorities, that is to His Excellency the Honorable Sir Arthur Foulkes, Governor General of the Bahamas, to the Right Honorable Perry Christie, MP and Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and Minister of Finance, to the Honorable Kendall Major, MP and Speaker of the House of Assembly of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, to Senator the Honorable Ms. Sharon Wilson, the President of the Senate of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and to the Permanent Secretaries of the Cabinet, the Governor General, and the Office of the Prime Minister. And I will entertain questions, if there are any.
Mr. Smith, I'd like to know exactly what's at the Clifton Heritage National Park right now. I think they had advertisements out for some of the key positions. Is it functioning or effective, or what's happening there now?
The key positions, you're not meaning the positions on the board.
No.
You're talking about the operational positions. I believe that Mr. Carey, I can't remember his first name at the moment, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the authority, is about to retire. And so that post will be replaced by someone. And so they would have been advertising for, I believe, that replacement and maybe other positions.
Director and assistant managing director and some key positions are vacant. That's why I'm asking. I mean, but I guess that doesn't affect
it doesn't affect what I'm trying to, what I am demanding to occur. I'm saying that the entire board should now resign, because what they have done essentially by aligning themselves publicly with the Bacon Coalition is to compromise the position that they are supposed to have as effective statutory trustees of this bit of land that is for all of us. And interestingly enough, it is important for me to point out that under the statute, the Clifton Heritage is not for anybody, you know. The Clifton Heritage is only for Bahamians. It is being held only for Bahamians. It doesn't mean that other people can't visit there, but it is only for the Bahamians, and so only the Bahamians have a right. And so I take advantage of my right as a Bahamian, and on a number of people, hundreds of people who have and who do support. In fact, hundreds of people who will be conducting a vigil at the Clifton Heritage this coming Sunday at 3 p.m. We are going to demonstrate to all and sundry, particularly the Clifton Heritage Authority, that this land is the Bahamian people's land, and whatever it is that you might wish to do individually as a board member is your business, but you cannot carry the name of Clifton with you when you do those things. And depending on the position that you have, even if you don't call and invoke the name Clifton, it will still connote that you bring in Clifton with you when you do these reprehensible things. And so what Dr. Wisdom and Mr. Bennett and Mr. Atkinson has done by allowing themselves to be published in the paper to take a side in an outstanding legal matter, I mean, it's amazing to me that they could allow anybody to make them do that. And so it really makes me question as to what their motives were or what could have cajoled them to do what they have now done.
I remember recently Mr. Wiley mentioning that he had appealed to Mr. Bacon for, I guess, to see if there for assistance, at which time Mr. Bacon said that he thought he didn't want to align himself with anything connected to slavery, per se. This would have been, I guess, some years ago. And Mr. Wiley said that publicly. How then does he get this, I guess, forefront position in the same place that he said he didn't want anything to do with?
Well, I can't speak and will not speak to what Mr. Wiley would have said.